Again, coming at you with another video today. This time I give you the book review that I promised you guys today. As an author named Christopher Loferdo suggested me to review his book on Death, Disease, and Life at War, the Civil War Letters of Surgeon James D. Benton, 111th and 98th New York Infantry Regiments, 1862 to 1865. So I'll be giving you a little book review on that, and also be teaching you guys a little bit today about what surgeons experienced in the war, and kind of taking away the bad image that's usually portrayed of them, and kind of seeing them now as actually the unsung heroes who did their best to try to save men's and civilians' lives. So I'll be giving you a review of that today. But first, I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about what the surgeon's life was like. But typically before the war, both sides, North and South, were not medically prepared. They weren't ready to treat the mass amounts of wounded that were going to be coming to their hospitals. They were not prepared to administer the health needs and requests of soldiers and civilians. They were also unprepared for how their armies would treat and transport their wounded. How would they mainly treat the wounded, and how they would transport them, maybe specifically through an ambulance corps, which I'll touch on later in the video. It also, they didn't have a really complete triage system. They didn't have a complete system that's set up to help treat the wounded men in a specific way. Now we look at our medical facilities today, they're very well ordered, and actually people don't realize that actually that comes and stems from the Civil War. Both sides were also unprepared for the really unpreparedness of overcrowded camps, which led to many forms of disease, mainly measles, smallpox, etc. All the childhood diseases that you can think of. Many would also due to poor sanitation, hygiene. Soldiers wouldn't wash their clothes for days. They would just let them wash out. They would also, this would be a really poor diet, high in calories and not really good in vitamins. When you look at today, we kind of place an importance on that, but back then it didn't really have a huge importance on how a strict diet was meant to be. But at that time, they had soldiers did not have a really good diet. But this also plays into terms of where these soldiers came from. Most Civil War soldiers came from farms, and the rest of them came either from prisons or cities. That when these farm boys were cramped into these camps or in winter quarters, they would be really a claustrophobic kind of era or euphoria, if you will. And they really, when they were cramped together, these diseases would spread out and touch each individual. And these diseases, the farm boys would mostly get these diseases because they were not exposed to it, like the city guys who were immune to the disease and experienced it and were able to combat it. And it's a really interesting development there once you see it throughout the war, because a third of soldiers actually did not die from combat. Most of it was from disease. And again, smallpox, measles, chickenpox, childhood diseases, you can name any of the two. And it's a really, as you can see here, also, there was no proper hospitalization system in place. There was no proper structure or system to how hospitals were organized, and there was no mainly keeping of reports or medical records to see how these men would recover or how these men died from either wounds from battle or disease. They didn't have specific enough records to place in their hospital record keeping, and as a result, before the war was totally disorganized. Mainly after the battles. Mainly once after a battle was over, they would make makeshift hospitals in a town or city. They would mainly use churches, schoolhouses, regular houses, seminaries, colleges. You can name any of the two. And especially when you looked in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, every single place in that town, in that Gettysburg area, was a hospital. One example I thought of was, an account from a woman who said that after the battle was over, books were used as pillows and tables were sometimes used as beds. Sometimes they let the soldiers use their own beds to lay down and recover from their wounds from the battle. So you see every place in that area, or in any place in the Civil War, if you think about it, every place was a hospital. And especially also in Alexandria, Virginia, I can't remember what the exact place was, but had about 1,700 wounded and sick men during the war. and you can see that they didn't have a proper um, didn't really have a proper structure, and they didn't really have any ways to try to organize it so that they can pretty much, just, you know, explain it all. There's no way that they were organized. But changes would come. They would come during the war, especially in 1862. But now I'll give you a little bit of history here about surgeons in the Civil War. And when you look at this mainly in the context of the Civil War and Civil War medicine in this time actually would develop and progress into modern medicine that's kind of known today, especially how they try to help save as many men as they could. So now I'll give you the history of doctors. At the start of the war, there were about a couple 30 doctors throughout the country. As you can see, that again, remember, just like in the Civil War, people were not prepared for this war, because they were really thinking that it was going to be a short war, it's going to be 9 days war, 3-month war, and after the first battle of Bull Run, that kind of destroyed that ideal as well, because there was like 4,500 casualties, and that was the bloodiest battle it was the biggest battle of the war at that time, and because 4,000, that's a big number. But by the end of the war, they would have 11,000 surgeons after the end of the war, because most of these surgeons actually didn't go through the rigorous training that medical doctors today go through. They don't go through the testings. They don't go through the practicings of becoming a surgeon or a medical doctor or anything else in the medical field. They really just were not prepared for this kind of war. But if you wanted to become a doctor, if you wanted to be a doctor, you would have to become enrolled in medical schools. And I was watching a little bit of reference. They said there are about 40 medical schools in the country by the time at the beginning of the war. You would pay an enrollment fee. You would attend lectures on how to become a doctor. They would teach you how to do the different procedures. Kind of like today a little bit, and how they teach you about medical fields. I'm not in the medical field. I'm trying to pronounce as best I can. They would really just teach you the same lectures actually every year, and you would pay an enrollment fee to listen on these lectures. And once after that, you would probably have to take a test, and if you pass it, you're a doctor. So you can see that's not really a good way of presenting this kind of way in one of these for these doctors to be prepared for the war. And also they just learned on the job. Once the war started, they just try to learn on the job and how they try to treat wounded or sick men, and they would just be learning on the job consistently every single day. Sip, snap, sip, snap, sip, snap, working tirelessly trying to save men's lives. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of history, a brief bit of history about medical medicine progression. But I'm going to give you one part because there's a lot of expression. I'll put some links in the description box below so you can do some more research on your own if you like to. And but I'm just going to give you one part of it, history, that I think was really impactful on how medicine is treated today and how it was influenced in the Civil War. Okay, so now we got to talk into the ambulance corps. Now, what I was talking about earlier, we talked about the transportation and treatment of the wounded. Now, after the first Battle of Bull Run, which was fought in July of 1861, wounded Union men were actually laid out on the field for a couple days and were not transported properly because the armies were, again, people thought there was going to be a short war. And what happened was they relied on civilians to actually use their wagons to actually help transport the wounded, or they would use drummer boys to become stretcher bearers and try to get the wounded men off the field. So you can see it's a very disorganized way of trying to treat the wounded and help save these men, transport them off the field. The wounded men were left on the field for 8 days. Drummer boys would be stretcher bearers to help transport the wounded. But now here comes in 1862 with the Army of the Potomac, and here comes the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. His name is Jonathan Letterman, along with other medical leaders in the Army of the Potomac that tried to make changes into this army that implemented itself throughout the rest of the war. He established an organized ambulance corps. What he did was instead of relying on the old system, he actually developed widened sizes of these ambulances and wagons to accommodate more soldiers and more space. Because when you look at wagons at the time, they didn't really have enough space for men to climb into, and they would be cramped immediately. So he widened the spaces so that it could carry amounts of men at a time, so that they could be transported off the field. 3 ambulances or more were assigned to one regiment. By the beginning of 1862, there were like 2 to each regiment, and a 68 regiment consisted of 1,000 men, but he had at least to have 1 surgeon and 2 assistant surgeons, I believe it was the record in the book that I read. And there was also, they were assigned for each regiment so that they can take these men off the field. So you can see it's a very well organized structure here. But he just said in this one, he's called for soldiers to volunteer to become ambulance drivers or stretcher bearers. So, and they were trained very, very professionally. They taught them that you need to make sure you make it go on roads that make it less bumpy, so that it's not uncomfortable for the men who were wounded in the cart. And if you're a stretcher bearer, and if I could stand up for a bit, if you're a stretcher bearer, you would have to basically, back in the old days, they would carry it like this, especially, but they would take light steps in order to carry these men outside so they don't get bumpy and don't make them uncomfortable. And plus, it also shortens the risk of making the wound even worse. He also developed shocks on these things so that it would become less bumpy, but become more stable in these ambulance corps, and become less troubling. It also created the triage system. And an example I'm going to give you is that when assistant surgeons, during a battle, they would be setting up behind the front lines while the fighting was going on, and they would set up forward aid stations that would accommodate to men's wounds, tell them how severe they are, and if they're severe enough, in these cases amputation, they would be taken to the Corps hospital. And I'll give you an example here. There's a corps called the Union 11th Corps at the Battle of Gettysburg, and they had a hospital at a place called Spangler Farm, which was a main hospital for the Corps level, because at the time they thought a surgeon was, because before the war they really thought the surgeon was meant to be at a regimental level. But now with Jonathan Letterman's and rest of other medical leaders changes, they decided to make it at a divisional and corps level. So each surgeon was available for every soldier in that corps. So I'll give you a little bit of the military history too. So let's see, you got commanding general, obviously of the army. You got you're made up of corps, which obviously generals command those corps. You got divisions that are made up of different things called brigades, and then you got things called into regiments. So I hope I give you a little sense of here what that looks like. This also includes artillery and cavalry as well. So once you got to these forward aid stations, what they would do was, if you got an artillery wound stuck in your eye, they would tell you, if you had some kind of artillery wound, either to your eye or to your stomach or to your shoulder or arm, they would tell you to sit down, sit down over here. They would have you sit down, and they'd say, well, we'll get you to you in a minute. But by that time, sometimes mostly those men would have died in your short wounds. But there have been miracles where men would survive these horrific wounds from battle. If you had like a little severe thing, like if, say, if a mini ball like creased your hand or creased your arm, they would just bandage it up, and then they just say, okay, you can go back out in the firing line now. And what they did was also, for if you got, say, and I'm going to pull up my leg here, if you got shot in the little collarbone, in a little bone here, because when you remember reading about the Minet ball in the Civil War, it was a conical shape that would hit the bone and crush it, and it was a very deadly bullet that really made there were so many amputations. So if you got hit here, it would just crease in there and break off your bone. And if it was severe enough, the assistant surgeon would say, okay, you need to go to the Corps hospital, you need to go to the Corps level. So they would take him, they would put him up in the ambulance as a result, and then they would transport him to a place where surgeons, assistant surgeons would take usually doors, anything that they could find to use to lay out an amputation place where mostly the most gruesome things of the war took place. But remember, this is a new triage system. This was the thing that they used at the time with the best of the knowledge they had to save men's lives. So serious wound, again, going through that you had a serious wound, you wait here. Minor wound, bandage it up. And then what would happen is, and again, if you had a really severe wound, like I showed you earlier with the musket ball wound, you would have to be sent to the Corps level hospital for either amputation. But most of these men would live from these amputations. And so what I'll do now is I'll teach you a little bit about how they did this. And I have a little knife here, and I'm not going to cut myself, but what I'm going to show you here is how they kind of did it to kind of try to amputate things. So what they did first was, number one, they would take a little rope and cut off the circulation and blood flow of the area so that there wasn't enough. I can't remember what the term was. They made sure that the soldier did not die of any blood that got lost. So they would cut off the circulation by usually tying it around the knee or around any other area of the leg. And then what would happen was, in the next part, they would take a knife, and either if it was an arm or leg, I'm going to point you right here, usually they would just take it and they just make a little dash of lines here in the skin. And what they do after this, and I'm not going to cut myself, just in a little imaginary fashion, they would do something like this. And then what they would do is that they would kind of peel the skin off a little bit in the arm or the leg so that they get down to the bone muscle where the bullet is. So that's where they would do. And then after that, once that was done, then came the amputation part. Then you had, but just imagine, this is not the bone saw. This is not the bone saw, but just give you a little imagination. It's a bigger one, and I can include a picture of this in here too. It kind of shows you it had a little bigger shape, and then bigger shape than this, kind of like a bigger than a kitchen knife. And then once you have the knife, then the amputation part comes in 1, 2, 3, and then as a result, the assistant surgeons would actually help assist in keeping the patient down, either by, and this is another thing too, anesthesia was available in the war, but it was used to like a thing called heroic dosing, which sometimes it would be given too much. There would be instances where soldiers died as a result of overdoses. And it really shows you how these men use these stuff to save these men's lives. But usually it was anesthetic that would just knock them out, or it makes you feel like you're drowning, like that. So it's a really interesting way how they did it. So as a result, these surgeon would pick up the limb, and then as some generals' accounts would say and soldiers' accounts would say, they would throw limbs of legs and arms, anything that you could think of, into piles. As you see, it's very, very graphic stuff. But this is the best triage system that they came up with, and it was actually very more organized, and kind of led to example of hospitals today and how they organize things as well to keep medical records, etc., etc., etc. Usually a surgeon would take about 15 to 25 minutes to do an amputation, and that'll be every single minute, so he did not stop. I remember reading an account of a surgeon who was working 36 straight hours trying to save men's lives. And it's a really, really interesting way of how these men really cared about these soldiers. And usually it would work tirelessly under intense conditions. Sometimes their shells would be bursting overhead in these forward aid stations and core hospitals. Sometimes it'd be in the thick of the action, just trying to save men's lives. So you can see it's a very, very intense job, very, very intense. Conditions, sometimes hours or days they would take them. And especially after the Battle of Gettysburg, where the last wounded soldier was left until November of 1863, it shows you that these surgeons at these battles really worked tirelessly and hard to try to save these men, despite the horrific conditions that they endured. And as a result, later, hospitals like Camp Letterman in the war would be set up. Specific hospital systems, after these men were recovered from the wounds, they would be sent to the better hospitals in areas like Washington, D.C. or Richmond. Both sides did this, and they organized better a hospital organization with hospital records, keep track of the men who were recovered from the wound or who died from sickness or was killed in action. Both sides, North and South, would do this as a whole. So now that I taught you a little bit about the history of it, and I'll include links in the description box below where you can research, if you want to research more about surgeons in the Civil War, you can look at that. But now I'm going to go to my book review. And the book review of this book is very, very interesting. And I love that the author, Christopher Loebfido, he did an amazing job of not getting in the way of James Benton's story. James C. Benton was born in New York. He was trained as an assistant surgeon and was assigned to 2 regiments, the 111th and 98th New York Infantry, and he was fought in the Eastern Theater of the war. And as you can see, he did all the same kind of jobs and things that assistant surgeons did, like I explained to you. And what he did was, instead of him telling the story of James Benton, he actually let James Benton tell it himself by using his letters, his diary entries, mainly they were sent to his family and his friends and his loved ones. Um, he did it in really spectacular fashion of showing what the life of a surgeon was like in the Civil War, and he did it really well. Clearly, they would take. One thing I liked in the book was how he described Camp Benton, which was in Chicago, which also was a prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. He would talk about the sick calls he would take of trying to treat these wounded and diseased men in the camp as well as Confederates. During the war, he also caught some disease too, but that he recovered from. And obviously, throughout the battles, most of his letters were written because he was so overwhelmed by assistant surgeon duties like amputations, checking out what wounds there are, assigning wounded men to different areas. So you can see that the whole triage system is shown through his experience, which I liked it very well. But the best part I loved was when later in the war, he was at the siege of Petersburg. And if you know what Petersburg is in southern Virginia. It's a little bit southways of Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy at that time. And the reason why it was important is because Ulysses S. Grant, who commanded the armies there, who laid siege to it, needed to destroy Lee's army and cut off rail supplies that were connected to the sea. It had railroads. It had many ways of connecting the last of Confederacy supplies to Lee. And after the end of the siege, all those supplies and railroads would be cut off from Lee and just destroyed immediately. And James Benton really describes the siege of Petersburg so well. I think it's the most accurate depiction of Petersburg. He would talk about in his letters how he's saying there was cannons firing all the time. He would also hear the big incessant booms of a thing called mortar, which was a big, huge cannon in the Civil War. It had about it was literally about the size of this room here, and it would just literally fire off these rounds. Say it could feel the pounding of these artillery shells in the ground, and just impacting the city on the Confederates trying to defend that city. And he would just talk about how there was trench lines, and this was at a time now when trench warfare is starting to be in place. The first place started with the Civil War. And he would talk about how men and him would dig trench lines trying to get closer to the Confederates without, going with the old Napoleonic warfare tactics. And he described the landscape very well. He described that it was hard-worn, it was muddy, it was rainy all the time. James Benton left a really good description of life at Petersburg. And I'll put a link for it too if you want to learn more about the siege or Battle of Petersburg. And also I suggest you look at the Grant book because that's another good book that talks about it as well. So, what do I think of it? I liked it. It was a very good book. I liked seeing the experience of a surgeon instead of a soldier sometimes. I like reading all experiences of soldiers, surgeons, anybody in the war. But this one was a really good description of his life. So I'm giving it 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it how he described basically everything. And also at the end of the book, they have these things called appendixes, which talks about the medical history of the war. And this is where I took my notes out of. So it's a really interesting book, guys. I highly suggest it. Shout out to Mr. Loferdo. Thank you so much for suggesting me to this book. I really appreciate it. And if you guys have any questions about this, shoot me a comment in the comment section below. If you liked this video, give it a like. Subscribe and click the bell notification next to the subscribe button so that you can get new videos every day. And that is all I have for you today, guys. Hopefully you learned something out of this, and I'll put links in the description box below so I can give you guys a little bit more information about what I learned and after reading this book. I give Death, Disease, and Life at War, the Civil War letters of Surgeon James E. Benton, 111th 98th New York Infantry Regiments, 1862 to 1865. I give it 5 out of 5. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. You guys have a blessed day. I'll see you later.